Hello, so in this video we're going to look at the Black Death. In particular, we're going to look at what the Black Death was, how it was spread, and what people believed spread it. And then finally, in the biggest section of this video, is going to be looking at the impacts. So the short-term impacts and the long-term impacts on medieval society. Now, to start off with, the disease itself. Now, there are three different types of what is overall called the Black Death. There's bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, and septicemic plague. So bubonic plague is the one that's traditionally seen where people have big lumps under their arms or on the neck, and that's the one that's spread by rats and fleas. We've also got pneumonic plague, which is a similar kind of plague, spread in the same way, but crucially it attacks the lungs. Okay, so it affects the way people can breathe. And then finally, septicemic plague, again, spread in a very similar way, but it attacks the blood and the blood supply. So that's the type of the disease. There are three different types we're going to look at. Now, if we're looking at how it was spread, it started, or most people believe from the accounts that we have, that it started in the East. Okay, so a lot of people think it started in modern-day Mongolia or even China, and then spread through the East in ports and things like that, through Europe, which you can see on this map, until it eventually arrives in England in 1348. So we've got the arrival in England, and as this account shows, it arrives in the town of Melcombe, which is in Dorset, okay, in 1348. And it was brought, as it says in the account, by sailors from Gascony, which is in France, on their ship, okay, and then it really quickly starts to spread throughout England. Now, at the time, most people believed that the Black Death was either caused by miasma, which is bad smells, or was a punishment from God. Okay, so it's really important to think about those when we think about the impacts on people psychologically and why potentially such a large proportion of the population were killed by this disease. Now, it's really important with the Black Death to categorise the impacts into short-term and long-term. So the things that happen straight away and perhaps the things that happened over a longer period of time, some which was still happening hundreds of years later, was quite a slow process. Now, if you think about the short-term impacts, the most obvious short-term impact is the number of people who died. Now, it's quite tricky in terms of the exact number, but most people believe that across England and across Europe, between 30 and 45% of the population were killed between 1348 and 1350. So in those 2 years, between 30 and 45% of the population were killed. Now, that's an average across the country, but there were places, an example of this is Kilkenny in Ireland, where estimates actually think it was more like 90 to 100%, and entire villages, in fact, were wiped out by this disease. Now, think about other impacts. Now, with less people about, but jobs still needed to be done, there was at the time, for a short period of time, an increase in the wages that people could demand, so the money that they could ask from their lords or perhaps for different jobs that they were doing in the towns. And also, going back to when we said about the causes and people believing it was religion, people at this time, quite a short-term impact was to live their lives as if every day was the last and to start questioning perhaps some of those religious beliefs that they had held. Now that brings us on to the longer term impacts, and this is by no means all of them, but just a few that we're going to look at. Now, it did happen in 1348 to 1350, and we talked about how between 30 and 45% of the population were killed. But actually, the plague kept coming back. So we've got records and accounts of the plague coming back in 1361, 1368, 1371, 1373, 1390, and 1405. And it actually keeps coming back beyond that. That just gives you a short idea. It's not just a single event, the Black Death. It does keep coming back. Now, also, a longer term impact is a religious movement called the Lollards. Okay, and the Lollards were a group of people who believed that religious men and women should wear and live quite simple lives. Okay, and wanted things like the Bible to be translated into English. And some historians think the Black Death really kick-started some of these ideas. Now, one of the really longer term impacts over a longer period of time is the end of the feudal system. Okay, this at the end of this structure where peasants and serfs farmed areas of land for their lords. Now, this started to really work away at this system because there was less people. They were starting to demand more money, and if they didn't get more money, they could move to different farms. And this gave them a bit of a taste for that better life, perhaps, that they could achieve. And finally, linked to some of the shorter term impacts, like the raising of wages, you have the statute of labourers, which stops the peasants from earning as much. And a lot of historians have said that in 1381, so we're talking 30 years later, that this was one of the major causes of the peasants' revolt, because the peasants were really unhappy about this being limited. And again, that leads to this working away at the feudal system. So that's a really quick overview of the Black Death, what it was, what people think that it was caused by, and some of the short-term and long-term impacts. Thank you.